Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have a very engaging episode for you today. As always, you can find us on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show, or you can ask your questions to our experts on the Vimeo dialog box below the video. You can sign up for our latest news alerts at aerospace.org/policy as well. Today's discussion is on the weaponization of space. We have two policy experts from the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy, Mick, Gleason and Robin Dickey. Mick co-authored the newly released Space Agenda 2021 chapter titled A Roadmap for Assessing Space Weapons with Peter Hayes. Mick is a senior policy analyst at CSPS, and he's well known for his space policy research in international cooperation, space traffic management, and national security, as well as deterrence. He spent 29 years in the Air Force focused on spacecraft operations and space policy. Robin recently published a CSPS paper titled The Rise and Fall of the Space Sanctuary in U.S. Policy. Robin is an associate member of the technical staff at CSPS. Her focus is on national security, geopolitics, and international relations. Her experience also includes risk analysis, legislative affairs, and international development. Over to you, Robin and Mick, to get us started.
Thanks, Rebecca. Really happy to be here today with a colleague, Mick Gleason. Mick, how are you?
Hello, how are you? I'm happy to be here too. It's always great to be on the Space Policy Show. We're happy today to talk about our papers. We think that they'd be of high interest to just about everybody out there.
Yeah, and a good time to talk about these two issues in tandem.
Yeah, they dovetail together very nicely. And so if you don't mind, should we just get right into it? I can start ask you a lead off question, and then we can take turns kind of going back and forth and talking with each other about our papers and kind of show how they dovetail together. Would that be a good idea?
Absolutely. Ask away.
All right. Well, I better get on my reading glasses so I can see my questions here and my notes. So before we get into my chapter, why don't you give us some background on how your paper came about? And what did you find in your research on the history of space weapons?
Yeah, so my paper is called The Rise and Fall of Space Sanctuary in U.S. Policy. So it is a very policy-focused paper. And the way it kind of came about was I was reading a lot of kind of statements in the last 5 or so years of government officials using the phrase that space is no longer a sanctuary. And it just struck me as something that I wanted to dig into more because I knew that there had been space weapons systems in the past. And basically there have been some kind of anti-satellite weapon since as early as the 1960s. And so I thought that was kind of a strange dichotomy of people saying it used to be a sanctuary, but there were also these kinds of programs. So what I found in the research that I did was from a policy standpoint, as I discussed throughout the paper, there was a transition from a policy that treated space as a sanctuary kind of from about 1957 to the mid-1970s, really championed by President Eisenhower. And that was using a lot of kind of space arms control means to try to delegitimize conflict in space. But since the 1970s, which was around the time that the Soviets were testing their own anti-satellite weapon, which was a co-orbital system, the officials in the U.S. decided that the U.S. needed its own operational anti-satellite system. And so that was authorized in the Ford administration and then carried out under the Carter and Reagan administrations up until they actually tested the system in 1985 by destroying a satellite using a missile launched from an F-15. And so after that, we saw a lot more congressional pushback. So this program never really got to be fully operational because Congress would cut the funding to testing. And then the end of the Cold War, of course, helped to bring about an end to a lot of the programs that were most competitive with the Soviet Union. And so we see that there have been these kinds of weapon systems come and go, often more in the research and development phase. Some of them deployed or operational as they were in the 1960s. Those were actually nuclear tipped anti-satellite weapons. After officials kind of learned how dangerous the effects of radiation from a nuclear blast in space could be on satellites, they really stopped thinking about using that kind of weapon operationally. And so that was kind of the first big shift I saw in space weapons development. And then the other big shift I saw was actually more recently, but it was in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, where the consideration of space weapons came alongside the knowledge of how damaging space debris could be. And so this led to a shift in thinking about maybe we need more temporary, reversible, non-debris creating systems if we're going to think about having weapons in space. But in terms of the debate itself, it's actually been it's been patchy. It's come and gone. I would say it was biggest in the 1980s during the Strategic Defense Initiative, and then came up again somewhat in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I will now turn it to you, Mick, because I know you have some really interesting thoughts and findings on how the debate from those eras kind of compares to today. So why don't you now take a chance to talk about your paper, how it came about, and some of your kind of initial findings?
Oh, thanks, Robin. So the motivation for this paper, first of all, the topic has, of course, been around ever since in my life in 1983 when Ronald Reagan made a speech called the SDI speech. I'm actually old enough to remember that. And it started me thinking about space weapons. And, it's been a very a topic of discussion since then, almost 40 years, I guess. And so it's been in the back of my mind that I'd like to do a paper about space weapons someday. And then the opportunity presented itself when the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy decided to put out its Space Agenda 2021 series this fall. Which is going to have a lot of interesting topics. We're going to have topics on space deterrence, the reorganization of the defense space sector with the U.S. Space Force, the U.S. Space Command. We're going to be talking about cislunar topics and issues, Arctic issues related to space, and so many great papers that are coming out. And so I thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity to do a paper about space weapons. So then I was like, how do you what do I want to talk about when I'm talking about space weapons? What they are, what the issues are, where's the current debate? And so I started doing a little bit of research on the current debate on space weapons, because as I mentioned, throughout my last 40 years, I thought there had been a debate going on. But as I started to do my literature review, I discovered that there really has not been a debate on space weapons, on U.S. space weapons, probably since the early 2000s, maybe peaking around 2002, 2003, and kind of tapering away by 2006. And that just kind of, when I was looking at all this old literature and old reasoning and old thinking and old assumptions, old alternatives, it dawned on me like, hey, there needs to be a new conversation. There needs to be a new debate in the U.S. On the merits of space weapons. And that includes Earth to space weapons, space to space weapons, and even space to Earth weapons that could strike the Earth from outer space. What are the pros and cons of these kinds of weapons? And where has the conversation gone in the last 15 years? So that was kind of the motivation was, hey, let's see if we can get some fresh thinking regarding the importance, or like, once again, the merits of space weapons and the risks of space weapons, because there are a lot of risks. And so with that in mind, I kind of laid out defining what are space weapons, what was the old debate that I think is now kind of overcome by events, or a lot of the alternatives are non-operative anymore. And so, and then what is the new strategic context? Why do we need to have a new, fresh debate? First of all, we're not a unipolar power anymore. The previous two debates, we had the Cold War, SDI, 1980s, mainly focused on missile defenses, space-based missile defenses, which was always all for. It seemed like a good way to get out from underneath mutual assured destruction. We should be able to defend ourselves against missiles. The debate, of course, was about that it was destabilizing for nuclear deterrence because it would provide a first strike capability for the United States, which would nullify the Soviet Union's or other countries' retaliatory nuclear strike, secondary strike. And so it was considered destabilizing for nuclear deterrence. But in a principle, it sounded like a great idea to be able to defend ourselves from missiles. And if it took space-based weapons, that would be great. Then the Soviet Union went away in the 90s, and up through the early 2000s, the U.S., was the unipolar power in the world. Hard to say that all at once fast.
It's a tongue twister.
And we didn't need to worry too much about the old concerns were there, but Russia had changed. We were hoping Russia would become a partner with us. China, we were also hoping, had high hopes in the 90s and early 2000s that they would reform and become much more partners in the international system. And so the nuclear stability questions were still there, but they had kind of been dampened compared to in the Cold War. And then the US was just so significantly ahead of Russia and China that it seemed like, well, we can kind of do whatever we want without them being able to challenge us. That's not the case anymore. As we know, we're in a new era of great power competition. Russia and China have tremendous space capabilities. China has deployed ground-based kinetic kill direct ascent ASAT weapons. Russia has a growing counter space program. And so we need to think through, like, the dynamic has changed, the context has changed. And so we can't just base our thinking on the thinking from 20 years ago. We need to refresh all that thinking. So how does that compare with your findings, Robin, on the discussions of space weapons and conflict in the space domain?
So what I found was really interesting from a policy perspective is that, especially since the 70s, the policy has been very permissive of space weapons. Very little in US policy would say something like, these are banned, we can't have these. But at the same time, most of the policy actually makes no mention of space weapons. And instead, it would focus on specific concepts or actions in space. So some of the buzzwords like space control, the idea of preserving freedom of action for one's own systems in space while denying that same freedom of action to adversaries. That was a big one that comes up a lot when you look at the policy. But it doesn't actually say what should be used for space control. So the debate on space weapons has really been kind of left out of those top policy documents. And instead, I saw played out at a lot of different levels and between different groups, depending on, say, whether it was the Army or the Air Force that was in charge of a specific program. And so I think that shows a bit of an interesting nuance when you compare it to your findings of when the debates have come and gone. Is if you're just reading the policy documents, you might actually not be able to tell that there was a debate at all when it came to space weapons in particular. And so I just found that very interesting. And what do you think were some of the biggest changes affecting that space weapons debate today? I know you had a couple kind of three big points that you wanted to make.
Well, as I mentioned, we're not a unipolar power anymore. It's we're in an era of great power competition. Our competitors have great capabilities. In the previous debate from 20 years ago, roughly 20 years ago, the the key alternatives seem to be, after doing a lot of this research from the literature, from the debate of that era, which I discovered was kind of the last say on it in the last 15 or 20 years. There was it boiled down to two primary alternatives that I kind of derived from all this literature and all these arguments in the debate. And the alternatives were, number one, the US should leap ahead of Russia and China and take be dominant in space and just have this leap ahead that would put us ahead in space for decades, was the idea of, if the US was the first to deploy space weapons, we could control space, we'd be able to dominate space. The other alternative that was discussed was not doing that, was the US should show restraint by not deploying space weapons in order to not provoke China and Russia and or other countries into also developing space weapons, because the US would, that would threaten our space capabilities, our force enhancement space capabilities, if China and Russia were provoked into developing their own space weapons. And so that was one of the interesting things I found, was neither one of those alternatives, whether leaping ahead or showing restraint, it's a non-starter nowadays, because we're not going to leap ahead of China and Russia. They already have space weapons. And so we're not going to have some great advantage for 20 or 30 years by deploying space weapons first. The other thing is, like I just said, the alternative of showing restraint so they don't do that is also non-operative, because we showed restraint for the last 20 years, and they went ahead and built space weapons anyway. So neither one of those alternatives makes any sense anymore. So what are our current alternatives? It seems like it's kind of, my sense was that after the Chinese ASAT test of 2007 that left thousands of pieces of debris in space, and they demonstrated their capability, and the US did Operation Burnt Frost, where we took down a non-operative satellite with US capabilities, that it's almost as if it was case closed. I don't want to say it was, but that's right around the time frame when the debate petered out or disappeared. And it was just like, it's a done deal, it's not worth debating anymore, seems to be the sense. And so I want to try to stir that debate back up in this paper, because I think it needs to be reevaluated. It's not just simply case closed. We're going to have space weapons now since 2007 with China's test, US test, and Russian activities. The other thing, so what I would like to add into the debate is just the fact that Russia and China have capabilities now, but there's some other things that have come up in the last 20 years that have changed the strategic context. First and foremost is Russia and China have become very good at gray zone activities, gray zone warfare. And what do I mean by that? That gray zone warfare, gray zone activities, operating in the gray zone and so forth, is doing things that are aggressive but below the threshold of a conventional response, or a nuclear response for that matter. And so they might fiddle with our satellites with laser dazzling or jamming or close approaches or something like that. Or at least, we should be thinking through, like, how do we deter that from happening? And I haven't seen any discussion on that. And so that's one of the areas where I think, hey, there needs to be some fresh discussion on gray zone activities. So anyway, gray zone activities are one of the areas where I think we need to really think through this a little bit more than has been thought through in the past. I'm going to pause there for a second, Robin. I have a couple more, but I want to give you a chance to chime in.
Sure. And I think I know what some of your others are, and they tie well into my paper. So maybe I can also jump in on the conversation of overflight and norms regarding overflight and how they might be affected by space weapons. With my research, what I found very interesting from the Eisenhower administration was this look into the value of reconnaissance satellites. In 1960, Gary Powers was shot down in the U-2 over the Soviet Union. And this, along with a lot of other considerations of Soviet anti-aircraft capabilities and their general restrictions on any kind of surveillance or observation, and their secrecy when it came to their nuclear capabilities, meant that the US really needed a way to find out what the threat was when it came from the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And Eisenhower administrations, and basically every administration since, has recognized that satellites, reconnaissance satellites, play a really valuable role in looking into what was the Soviet Union, now Russia, and other countries that are developing nuclear and missile capabilities to monitor and verify things like arms control treaties, which was a really important role. And so Eisenhower really pursued this idea of unrestricted overflight. And of course, he tried to do this from a general perspective by proposing an open skies agreement with the Soviet Union. That would have been an actual binding agreement to allow satellites and planes to fly over other countries, specifically the US and the USSR, to monitor things like this nuclear activity. The USSR was not okay with that, but what they ended up accepting in the long run was the unrestricted ability of satellites to fly over the USSR. There haven't been any direct threats to that. There have been actual legal protections for that since, like in the ABM Treaty signed in 1972, which banned interference with national technical means of verification, which is another term that is often used to describe reconnaissance satellites. And so we have had, for all of these decades, either strict normative or legal protections for these kinds of nuclear observation satellites. And so the question becomes now, since that protection had more or less extended to other satellites in that they had never been directly attacked, what happens in the future if you have weapons based in space, which may then become more viable military targets in a conflict? Does that, add to the escalation? Does that further degrade the norm of unrestricted overflight, which then could lead to further threats to other kinds of satellites? And so if you have anything to add to that, Mick, I know this was a big issue that you looked into quite a bit.
As you mentioned, the Outer Space Treaty allows for peaceful overflight, which has come to mean non-aggressive overflight. So military satellites for communications, for GPS, positioning, timing, navigation, for weather satellites, for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. All those type of activities have been considered non-aggressive in the past 40, 50 years, peaceful use of outer space. But I think it's, kind of a stretch to think that literal space weapons would have any kind of protection within the right of peaceful uses of outer space. That's for others to decide, the lawyers, the State Department, the diplomats. But it seems on its face that, that could be challenged. The Outer Space Treaty does not prohibit weapons in outer space other than nuclear weapons, but that doesn't mean that weapons in space are protected by the Outer Space Treaty. And the same with the photo reconnaissance satellites for treaty verification. The Soviets agreed in 1972 in the ABM Treaty, like you mentioned, and the Russians in the 2010 New START Treaty. There's been a long line of succession of these nuclear arms control treaties, agreed that overflight, photo reconnaissance, and other national technical means of verification should not be interfered with. And so that's in the treaty, non-interference with national technical means of verification. But, there's a big hole there to walk through. Is like, is a space weapon a means for verifying a treaty? That would be kind of a hard argument to make, in my opinion. And then the other thing is the New START Treaty is set to expire in February of this year. And so that is the last treaty that has that protection in it. So here in 3 months or so, we're going to not have any, treaty even between the US and the Russians that prohibits interference with national technical means of verification with satellites. And so the question, becomes, is what is protecting the right of overflight? Even in peacetime, there was never a right in wartime for overflight. They could always be challenged. But even in peacetime, what is the unrestricted right of overflight? The norm is much broader than what these treaties grant. Could space weapons, oh, by the way, norms can change suddenly, as we can see in our society for many different examples. There's numerous examples of how societal norms change quickly and sometimes reverse 180 degrees. So could deployment of weapons in space actually trigger a reversal of that norm of unrestricted overflight? The thing that I've never heard anybody talking too much is about, and I think we should be concerned about, is Russia and China are developing space weapons. They could develop space to earth strike weapons. Now, we're not seeing that yet. There's no open source information. I don't know of anything that's actually those capabilities being developed or deployed or tested or anything yet. But if we wake up one morning and we find out that China has developed their own rods from God, type of kinetic earth strike capability, and they've put it in space and it's flying over the United States every 90 minutes, maybe it couldn't defeat us, even if there's one or a handful. But can you imagine if China was overflying the United States with some kind of with a space weapon that presented a grave threat to U.S. security? Maybe they could take one shot at the White House, or one shot at a military base, or one shot at an aircraft carrier in a harbor or port. How are we defending ourselves from that? Is anybody thinking about that? It doesn't seem like we should not be thinking about it. So anyway, there's according to the unrestricted right of overflight, this norm, the U.S. would not even be able to file diplomatic protest or say anything about it. And deploying space weapons might cause a change in that right of overflight, is what I think people should also be thinking seriously about. Back to you, Robin.
Yeah. Well, I think
don't like to drone on. I don't like to drone on too long.
Not too long. We'll see. I thought it was a good point that you made about how quickly norms can change. I think people commonly perceive norms as being these very slow, gradual things that develop over a long time and would therefore take a long time to erode. And certainly oftentimes that's the case. But I mean, I know that even when I went abroad for my first year of graduate school, when I left, plastic straws were a thing. And when I came back to the US 9 months later, plastic straws were gone. They had been completely removed from restaurants, and now there were paper straws. And so that's kind of a trivial example, but it's, seeing that difference just in a couple of months on something as ubiquitous as straws, you can see it being a similarly dramatic and rapid change, especially when something like national security is on the line with our satellites. And so, I think it's a great point about how quickly things can change. Do you have in mind any systems or any issues that you think would be particularly destabilizing from a weapons standpoint? I know, especially with the 2007 ASAT test and the debate that I saw in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's been a lot of concern about kinetic ASAT weapons because most of them would create some kind of space debris, which of course, that means you're not only is a single satellite being destroyed, but then there are thousands of literally tiny ballistic missiles, even if they're just paint chips, flying around at 17,000 miles per hour in orbit that could damage commercial, civilian, other countries' satellites. It's pretty indiscriminate. So that's what comes to mind for me when I think of, specific challenges that come with different weapons technologies. Do you have any others that you might want to bring up?
Not right off the top of my head. What I'd rather focus on is, once again, in my literature review and looking at the debate in the literature from 20 years ago or longer ago, back in the 90s, 80s, there was a lot of general discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of space weapons. It was just like space weapons, good or bad. Now I'm oversimplifying somewhat, but in general, I think it was true. It's like space weapons, good or bad. Kinetic weapons, you're right. There has been a lot of talk about, we need to, as our awareness of space debris has grown and the problem of space debris has grown, we've thought more and more about the dangers and the threats of kinetic weapons in outer space. But in general, I think the new debate needs discussion of specific weapons, whether they're the advantages and disadvantages of Earth to space weapons, space to space weapons, and space to Earth weapons. They all need to be considered separately because they all have different advantages and disadvantages. The another part thinking of that is, like, for example, satellites in low Earth orbit may be vulnerable to ground-based ASATs, kinetic ASATs, and space weapons, in LEO might be vulnerable to ground-based ASATs if an adversary want to counter them. And so maybe that's a big disadvantage. But maybe if a space-based weapon is up in geosynchronous orbit, real far away from Earth, they won't be as vulnerable to the ground-based ASATs, so they would make more sense in geosynchronous orbit. I'm not saying that that's the answer or solution. That's not my area of expertise, is to understand all the astrodynamics and those kind of threats. But in different orbits, different types of weapons might make no sense, or they might make some sense. And so I think that kind of gets at what you're asking, Robin. Did that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, I think that it's a good point that besides some of the discussion of debris and kinetic weapons that I brought up, there hasn't been that much debate yet on kind of the nuances between these. And that in some ways the conversation is what is the most important part. And, our job is more to encourage conversation and debate on those, and less to talk about, or focus on which specific thing we would recommend. But one thing I did want to ask that kind of, all of your research and mine too kind of begs the question of, why hasn't there been this debate that much in the last 5 or 10 years? Why do you think it has been so broad when it does exist, or just kind of something that maybe is taken as an assumption?
Yeah, I think once again, I think in around 2007, when China did their ASAT test, and the U.S. in 2008 had burnt frost, and then there's been a progression of events with China and Russia since then, where it's almost like, the debate is over, case closed, we're going to have space weapons. Now I'm speculating on that. I'm not saying that that's really what's happened, but that's just the sense I got, because there's been so little discussion on it since around 2006. Is there must have been some watershed or marker event in there that caused this tapering out of a debate about space weapons. And so once again, I think that would be a mistake to just now start deploying space weapons without having taken into consideration some the new global context, the new strategic context. In your space sanctuary paper, Robin, what did you find out about 2007? Was that a watershed marker, a break in the policy?
Well, from a policy standpoint, it's interesting because the 2007 Chinese ASAT test clearly had a big impact in conversations about space policy, because I really found a wave after 2007 of officials declaring space is no longer a sanctuary, or we can no longer see it as a sanctuary, largely because the Chinese ASAT test demonstrated how contested, congested, and competitive space is. But on the flip side of that, from the actual kind of policy documentation that I saw, it wasn't so much of a pivot point or a major turn in space policy, because the idea of space as a contested domain had actually already been baked into the policy for many decades. And so instead of it being a change, it was more of kind of a new wave, or it presented new evidence in older arguments that kind of galvanized the conversation about contested space. But it's a good point that there hasn't been that much nuance in it, is that oftentimes the conversation starts and ends with space is no longer a sanctuary. We have to treat it as a contested domain. Or even in the last couple of years, taking it further, that space is a warfighting domain, which is now part of the policy as well. And so it is yet to be seen, what are the implications and the consequences of that. There's been some discussion, but there's been so much focus on whether space is or is not a sanctuary that it is somewhat kind of obscured maybe what the other nuances in the conversation are.
And so would that be like, why you think there hasn't been a debate on space weapons? Is it's just been obscured, or is it case closed?
I think that there's been a lot of focus on resiliency in satellites has been the fear, or the focus on the fact that satellites are vulnerable. And so I see a lot of the first priority in people's discussions being, how do you protect US satellites? And there's a recognition that although space weapons could be used for deterrence, you can't physically protect a satellite with a weapon necessarily, or that maybe we're not technologically at that point yet. So I think just the conversation is focused on other things, and that space weapons have kind of been pushed to the side in favor of focusing on reorganizing for space, as with the Space Force and US Space Command, reorganizing how you do acquisitions, because a lot of the conversation is about how our satellites are big and exquisite, and therefore, possibly juicy targets, and that perhaps if we had smaller, more distributed architectures, then we could actually, have more safety in the capability itself. So I've seen the debate a lot on the side of how do you protect satellites and how do you protect space capabilities. And so for whatever reason, space weapons just really haven't kind of factored into that debate that much yet.
Great. So I do have another thought that I just want to make clear to the audience out there. As we're raising these concerns in the roadmap for assessing space weapons paper and the sanctuary paper that Robin did, the rise and fall of space sanctuary policy, because we think there's these gaps in the discussion, and hopefully not some misperception on what is actually out there and what's going on. And then on the space weapons paper, I've raised all these concerns about maybe why the U.S. needs to consider, evaluate carefully the deployment of space weapons if a decision like that's going to be made someday in the future. Is there anything that you think it really decision makers need to consider, Robin, about space sanctuary and the rhetoric around that, and what going forward we should be thinking about when we think about this sanctuary policy, or not the contested space policy?
Certainly. I think kind of the big point of my paper is to understand what people are discussing as the major problems today. We need a bit of a better understanding of how we got to this point, whether it's from a policy standpoint, a program standpoint, a budgets standpoint. You have to actually break down each of these elements a little further, like I did with national security space policy, in order to understand what are the actual issues that we're facing, what are the real root causes, and what are maybe some things that we assumed were behind challenges we're facing that might not necessarily be those root causes. So that was kind of what I tried to get at with the paper, is that the national security policy, and specifically a policy of space as a sanctuary, can't really be blamed for any of the perceptions that we hadn't done enough to protect our satellites in the past, because the policy really had left it wide open, or it had directly stated that space is seen as a contested domain. And so of course, which begs the question then, what did lead to this perception? And so I think that better understanding of history in order to represent and see what you're going to do for the future going forward, and what the implications of those future actions might be, is something that's really important. they say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so the idea of what are some of the patterns? We've had 60 years of space activity. And, so although certain things haven't happened and may never happen, hopefully we never have to see shots fired in space, but, we can't rule out that possibility. So what can we look to in our past to see what might come next or how things might interact going forward is just kind of the main thing I want to lay on the table.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think at the root of both of our papers is the idea of challenging assumptions. Your paper does a good job challenging the assumption that it's because we've been thinking of space as a sanctuary that we need to work more to protect our satellites now. And you've discovered that might be a faulty assumption. So how do we know how to go forward if we're basing our decisions on faulty assumptions? And in the space weapons arena debate, I would also argue that there's assumptions, I think, out there on space weapons that need to be reevaluated. It's been 20 years since there was a lot of public discussion about space weapons. The alternatives are no longer valid. Many of the assumptions that we've had maybe in the back of our minds for the last 20 years need to be challenged and updated. And so I think, if I may be so bold to say, the foundation of both of our papers is, let's help the community to challenge assumptions so that we make sure we're making and helping inform decision makers to make the best decisions possible for the future of our security in the United States. And that's, always you have to challenge assumptions. It's a basic kind of an analytic type of thing to do before you go charging ahead making decisions.
Absolutely. I think that sums it up great. Well, I think that kind of goes through everything we wanted to talk about today. So I had a really great time talking with you, got to cover a lot. And thanks for having this chat with me.
All right. Thanks, Robin. Back over to you, Rebecca.
I would like to thank both of you, Robin, Mick, and our production team, James and Sarah, who are located in the LA area. We don't want you to miss next week's episode when we talk about satellite investment trends and the future of industry in the wake of pandemic economy with Karen Jones and Jason Rainbow. As always, you can find us on Twitter. We're at #TheSpacePolicyShow, or you can ask your question in the Vimeo dialog box below the video. I would also like to mention briefly that we've released a series of discussion papers called Space Agenda 2021. They're on topics that are already at the forefront or likely to emerge in the next few years. In addition to highlighting the issues, the series offers a concise background, analyses, and options to aid government decision makers, industry leaders, journalists, students, and other parties interested in the U.S. Future space efforts. If you want to find that, please visit our website. We're at aerospace.org/policy. There's a big banner. You can't miss it. And until next time, take care.